Okay, so let's start with something that might seem simple at first glance, but I promise you it opens a window into a much larger, more intricate reality. When American leaders, or leaders of any global power, make statements about another country being close to developing a nuclear weapon, what do they really mean? At face value, it sounds like a straightforward warning, be careful, a threat is imminent, but when we examine the history of these pronouncements over decades, a very strange pattern emerges. Over and over, the United States and other major powers have warned the public that a specific nation is on the verge of creating nuclear weapons. The timeline shifts. Sometimes the alarm is months away, sometimes a year, and sometimes it's just around the corner. Yet, year after year, the catastrophic deadline never fully arrives. Somehow, the threat is always imminent, but it never quite materializes in the time frame suggested. The clock resets, the deadline moves, and the sense of urgency persists, often through multiple administrations, despite changes in intelligence, policy, and leadership. So, the pressing question becomes, why does this pattern repeat itself? If this were a one-off error, we might chalk it up to poor judgment, bad intelligence, or simple human error. But when you see the same dynamic emerging across decades, across multiple countries, and under various administrations, you begin to suspect that something deeper is at work. It's not merely a mistake. It may be a deliberate political and strategic mechanism that functions to serve broader objectives. What if I want you to consider the narrative of the nuclear threat is not just a reactive statement about real dangers? What if instead it is doing strategic work beyond any single nation or any isolated crisis? What if the warnings about nuclear programs, weapons of mass destruction, or rogue states are part of a toolkit of political and strategic influence? The argument I want to explore is that this narrative serves multiple functions. It consolidates political unity at home, it justifies expansive military budgets and overseas engagements, and it preserves the legitimacy of a global order that could otherwise face questioning. The nuclear threat, in other words, is not simply a reflection of immediate dangers. It is a deliberate instrument of strategy, a way for great powers to maintain control, authority, and dominance in both domestic and international contexts. To make sense of this, I propose two ways of evaluating the claim. The first is historical analysis. If we look back across centuries of great power behavior, we can identify patterns in how empires respond to perceived threats and how they use those threats to consolidate internal authority and external advantage. History often repeats itself, not in exact detail but in structural logic, and these historical comparisons help illuminate the patterns we see today. The second approach is strategic logic, a way of asking why rational political actors would repeatedly behave in ways that seem, on the surface, disconnected from reality. Why would leaders exaggerate or emphasize a threat even when the actual danger is uncertain or minimal? Once we explore both, the answer becomes clearer, and the seemingly paradoxical pattern starts to make sense. Looking at history first, consider the Roman Republic around 200 BCE. Rome had just survived one of the most devastating wars of its early history, the Second Punic War against Carthage. A general named Hannibal famously crossed the Alps with elephants, nearly destroying Rome itself. Yet, Rome endured, and Carthage, weakened by the war and subsequent treaties, no longer posed a direct military threat. Its army was not rebuilding aggressively, and its ability to project power was severely limited. From a purely military standpoint, Carthage was no longer a serious danger. However, Roman politics did not operate solely on military realities. Roman leaders repeatedly emphasized that Carthage was still dangerous, that it might recover, and that it could one day threaten Rome again. One senator in particular, Cato the Elder, became notorious for ending nearly every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the phrase, Carthage must be destroyed. Whether the Senate debated tax reforms, agricultural policy, or trade disputes, Cato would always conclude with the same warning. At first glance, this seems almost absurdly repetitive, even comical, but there was a profound political logic underlying it. Cato understood the power of fear in shaping public opinion and political action. Societies facing an existential threat, or even a vividly imagined one, tend to unify in ways that peaceful societies cannot. Fear generates urgency, and urgency creates political momentum. Political momentum, once established, can be channeled toward objectives that might otherwise be impossible to achieve. Over time, the Roman public internalized the idea that Carthage was a mortal threat, and this collective perception enabled decisive action. Eventually, Rome launched the Third Punic War, resulting in the complete destruction of Carthage. The city was razed, its population killed or enslaved, and an entire civilization erased. Many historians argue that Carthage at that moment did not pose any serious threat to Rome, yet it scarcely mattered. The perception of danger had created political conditions so compelling that decisive, even extreme, action became inevitable. Fast forward roughly 0 years to 2003. The United States was preparing for a military invasion of Iraq, justified in large part by claims that the Iraqi regime possessed weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear programs, chemical weapons, and biological agents. These claims were presented as immediate and urgent threats. Iraq could use these weapons directly or provide them to terrorist organizations, representing a catastrophic danger not only to the United States but to the global community. The imagery was stark and compelling, the language urgent, and the political effect immense. Public support for the invasion grew steadily. Congress authorized military action, coalition forces were assembled, and the invasion proceeded. In the end, the feared weapons were never found. The extensive programs described with such certainty and detail simply did not exist as presented. Why did this happen? The reasons are complex. There were genuine intelligence failures, bureaucratic incentives favoring worst, case analyses, and, in some cases, deliberate manipulation or exaggeration. Likely, the outcome was a mix of all these factors. What matters for understanding the larger pattern, however, is the function the narrative served. The warnings about Iraq's nuclear and chemical programs created political conditions necessary for a large-scale military intervention that might otherwise have been politically impossible. Without the specter of an imminent existential threat, the justification for invading Iraq would have been far weaker. Once again, we see a pattern strikingly similar to Rome. Fear of a potentially catastrophic external threat is leveraged to consolidate political support for bold, decisive, and often destructive action. If we examine the broader sweep of history, the pattern becomes even clearer. Great powers, at certain stages of development, consistently rely on the perception of external threats to justify domestic and international policies. These threats provide a rationale for military budgets that might otherwise be criticized, for alliances that might otherwise seem unnecessary, and for global deployments of military force that might otherwise provoke public skepticism. Once such a system is established, it becomes difficult for any leader to depart from it, even if the actual threat is minimal. Political, institutional, and economic incentives combine to sustain the narrative, creating a self-reinforcing loop. This brings us to strategic logic, which helps explain why these patterns persist even when the reality of the threat is uncertain. Imagine for a moment that you are the leader of a large global power. Your country maintains military bases and alliances around the world. Your economy relies heavily on global trade networks and financial systems that have taken decades to build. Your domestic political system encompasses powerful defense industries, intelligence agencies, and security institutions that employ millions of people and control enormous budgets. Now imagine that the public begins to question all of this. Ordinary citizens start asking whether overseas military commitments are necessary, whether the defense budget is being spent wisely, or whether the global role your nation plays is actually improving life at home. This is a political problem of immense magnitude. If public support for global interventions and expansive military spending erodes, the very structure of national power is at risk. There are two ways to address this dilemma. One is painstakingly complex, explain the intricate calculations of international strategy, the logic behind forward deterrence, and the long-term rationale for maintaining global influence. But this requires patience, public trust, and a willingness to engage with nuanced qualities that are often in short supply. The other option is simpler, immediate, and profoundly effective. Identify a threat, make it tangible, make it urgent, and present it in a way that people instinctively understand. Nuclear weapons, in particular, are perfect for this purpose. They embody the ultimate form of danger, the potential for total destruction. The mere possibility that an adversary might acquire them is sufficient to generate widespread fear. Fear, as numerous studies in political psychology have shown, is one of the most potent tools for overriding skepticism and fostering political consensus. Once people are afraid, they are far more likely to support decisive action, to accept elevated military budgets, and to defer questions about the logic or morality of the strategy being pursued. In-game, theoretic terms, promoting a narrative of nuclear threat aligns public opinion with pre-established objectives. It reduces resistance to military expenditures, legitimizes a global security system favoring established institutions, and increases the political cost of dissent. Critics of the narrative risk being dismissed as naive or irresponsible, making opposition politically hazardous. Once this mechanism is set in motion, it tends to sustain itself. Intelligence agencies develop incentives to confirm rather than challenge threat narratives. Politicians repeat warnings because doing so is politically safe, whereas challenging the narrative carries risk. Media organizations amplify these warnings because fear and urgency drive engagement. Over time, the narrative embeds itself in public consciousness, becoming accepted as common sense rather than recognized as a strategic construct. Thus, the question returns, why do nuclear threat narratives appear consistently across decades and administrations in the politics of great powers? The answer is not mere incompetence or flawed intelligence. It is structural. Empires require justification for their global presence. Nuclear threats provide that justification in its most concentrated and emotionally resonant form. The pattern is deliberate, following from the incentives built into political systems, bureaucratic structures, and institutional frameworks. The repetition is not accidental. It is a calculated tool that aligns domestic support with strategic objectives. Yet, history also teaches caution. When threat narratives become disconnected from reality, they carry substantial risks. They can encourage overreach, leading to expensive conflicts, drained resources, and eventual erosion of political and military strength. The Roman Republic eventually became destabilized through its repeated wars and reliance on external threats to maintain internal cohesion. Similarly, prolonged conflicts in the Middle East in the early 21st century left the United States politically divided and strategically exhausted. What initially appeared as a powerful tool for consolidating authority and driving policy can, in the long term, become a trap, binding leaders to paths that are costly and difficult to escape. This does not mean that every nuclear threat is fabricated or imagined. Sometimes threats are real, and sometimes urgent action is required. However, understanding the political and strategic function of the nuclear threat narrative is essential. It reveals that what appears to be a story about weapons is, in reality, a story about power, fear, and the political systems that depend on both. The constantly resetting nuclear clock is not simply a tale of delayed danger, it is a window into how global power is maintained, how political systems mobilize public perception, and how leaders navigate the tension between reality and strategic necessity. Recognizing this pattern allows for a more nuanced understanding of international relations, one that sees beyond immediate threats to the underlying structures and incentives that drive behavior of great powers. In conclusion, when you hear repeated claims about countries on the brink of acquiring nuclear weapons, it is worth pausing to reflect on the broader context. The narrative is never only about bombs or technical programs. It is about sustaining authority, unifying domestic opinion, and reinforcing the legitimacy of global structures. From Cato in Rome to modern American policymakers, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Fear of external threats becomes a tool of political power, shaping decisions that alter the course of nations. The threat may shift, the deadlines may move, and the specifics may change, but the structural logic endures. Understanding this helps us see that the nuclear clock is less about counting months or years until a weapon exists, and more about understanding the intricate interplay of fear, power, and politics that has defined human history for millennia. By examining both history and strategy, we gain insight into why the narrative persists, why it is politically useful, and why it is likely to continue shaping the actions of great powers well into the future. The nuclear threat is not merely a technical problem, it is a deeply political one, a story that reveals far more about the mechanics of power than it does about the weapons themselves.